this topic tonight is very interesting. It's a topic about mapping the Sasquatch genome, or mapping the Bigfoot genome. And I'm beginning to wonder if my super fans are giving me topics that ultimately will embarrass me, but let's go for it. So enjoy tonight's episode on mapping Bigfoot's genome. Welcome to another episode of Topic Discuss. This is another topic I probably have been avoiding, to be honest. It is about mapping the Bigfoot genome, which is really strange. So we'll just dive right into it, and I'll tell you my own story and my own personal experience. This story does relate back to another video, another YouTube video on my channel about critical thinking. So we'll make some connections there. Remember, please subscribe and make some comments. And it's also really helpful if you watch all the way through. So what happened to me, or what happened in this world of the Sasquatch Genome Project in 2012, I think it was. The fall of 2012, or maybe, somewhere around there, I can remember reading a book. I at this time I was we have 5 small kids. They're all very close together in age. And in 2012, it felt we had a whole brood of these little ones. And so getting them to sleep at night was challenging. It's a little better now, but it was not very easy back then. So it was important for me to have things I could read while I was putting them to sleep or laying by them. So one book that I read, because I had always had this interest in Sasquatch, was by Meldrum, and that is When Legend Meets Science, I think. And I remember the night that I read that book, it was so interesting and so compelling, because Meldrum is an anthropologist, and in fact specializes in the footprints of humans and ancient humans, ancient hominids, and so he had this very scientific way of talking about Sasquatch evidence, and it was just fascinating to me, and I kind of fell down this rabbit hole, and I don't know why I did this. It had made me think over and over again about what's possible. Did this really happen, or is this real evidence? And I remember as a kid growing up seeing this Sasquatch film where Bigfoot's walking across. It's the Patterson-Gimlin film, and he's walking. Bigfoot is walking across the scene, and it's very compelling, and it's very interesting. And so as a kid, that kind of scared me, and I always kind of had monster fascinations as a kid. I would hear the Paddyfoot monster story from my Uncle Bill. I would hear these different stories about, Sasquatch or some other, kind of creature, werewolf type thing. I can remember this was, Jaws, and I was not old enough to see the original Jaws, but I can remember Jaws 2 and Jaws 2 and really Jaws, the first Jaws, you really didn't see this monster, right? You just saw a glimpse, and then everything else is implied. And that's kind of the monster stories that I really love today, but that they really fascinated me back then. And there is something fascinating about human evolution to me as well, right? So if there are there's this evidence of all these different types of ancient human species, Neanderthals and Denisovans and Arthropithecus, and Pithecus. I shouldn't try to talk about stuff I don't understand very well. Anyway, not an expert, but this is my story. So I've got this kind of fascination. I'm with my kids in the middle of the night, up late, reading this book by Jeff Meldrum. I'm fascinated, and he mentions or credits in his book the Olympic Project. And the Olympic Project, really, I thought it was interesting that he referenced the Olympic Project because a lot of evidence he had studied came from this group of people. And one of those individuals, or the person who started the Olympic Project, was Derek Randles. Now, here's where I did something that I think was out of character for me, but out of fascination and curiosity, I emailed Derek Randles, not thinking I'd ever get a reply. I didn't think I'd get a reply from Jeff Meldrum, but I thought, well, maybe I could ask Derek Randles about this thing happening, or on the Olympic Project, and what was it, and did he have more experience, right? Was he seeing something that wasn't mentioned in this book? So I got an immediate reply from Derek Randles, or maybe the next morning, but that sent me down a rabbit hole, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And so he reached back out to me, and my name is Gary Robert Stone, and so for some reason he thought that I was Robert Lindsay. So no one, I think, listening to this is going to know who Robert Lindsay is, but he ran a blog that talked about Bigfoot and talked about Sasquatch. He was kind of like an investigative reporter, and I had no idea at this time how much of an online, how much people lived in the online world. Like, they created these online persona, many of them fake, right? They could be somebody online that they aren't in real life. So either through blogging or through these forums or through Facebook. I wasn't on Facebook at the time. I didn't have any sense of what was happening in the online community, let alone in the Bigfoot online community. So I don't know who Robert Lindsay is. I find out who he is later, but that's who Derek Randles thinks that I am. So as we're talking to each other, he piques my interest even more and tells me about this genome project happening with a doctor named Melba Ketchum. And the fact that she's analyzing Bigfoot DNA, Sasquatch DNA. So of course, I'm even more intrigued, right? So science is very interesting to me. I want to understand what scientific evidence is out there, and I think there must be now. I've read Jeff Meldrum's book. Jeff Meldrum is a scientist. He's at Idaho University or Idaho State University, and I'm intrigued. So now there's a geneticist involved from Texas. Well, I wanted to know from Derek, well, where did this Bigfoot or Sasquatch DNA come from? It had to come from a sample. And he tells me the story of Justin Smeja, or Smeja. It's spelled S-M-E-J-A, Justin Smeja. and that story was probably another just fascinating tale to me. And I wish I could do it justice. I actually did speak to Justin Smeja on the phone I've heard him tell his story. And it goes like this. He and his buddy are hunting. And while they're hunting, they haven't been able to find a bear or something. This is in the Sierra Nevada and California mountains. And so they decide to pull over because, they're driving out of the forest at the end of the day. I don't know that they have, I can't remember some of these details, but I can remember distinctly that they saw something that they thought was a bear. And they pulled over, and this is late fall of, I don't remember what year, maybe 2010. Someone who knows the story better than me, I think, or can remember it better than me, make a comment below about the dates. But so he pulls over with his friend. He has his friend to pull the truck over, and then he gets out with a gun, and he gets this creature in his sights. And the creature stands up on both legs and looks at him. And he talks about how strange this creature was to him. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't really human, but it was kind of human and kind of ape-like and indescribable to him. But it was shocking. And the creature put his hands up, and Justin Smeja shoots at this thing, and it doesn't fall or I think it hit him. I think he saw, the creature hit, and then takes off running. So Justin and his friend freak out. Again, it's better to listen to his version of the story, but they chase after it, and they see it kind of tumble down into a thicket of kind of thorny bushes. And when they arrive at the thicket, they can't see the thing that they shot, or Justin shot, but they actually see two juveniles, two little ones. And I think this is probably the part of the story that became so strange and so wild to listen to, and made it even more compelling for me. These two little ones are kind of like sometimes walking on two legs, and then sometimes on all four, like chimpanzees, but not. They were human-like and childlike, but also chimpanzee-like, and they're looking for this other creature that had kind of rolled into the thicket, and they're making sounds at each other. It's kind of this gibberish, according to Justin Smeja. And they start looking like they're getting more and more aggressive towards him, anyway, so he decides to shoot one of them, and it kills it, and he was at the bottom of a small hill when he shot this one that he thought was going to come and attack him. And he shoots it, and it rolls down onto his boot, bleeding and dead. And when I talked to him, he told me that when he was that he picked up this creature and held it, and all he could think about is it reminded him of his own child. It was so human-like. So they're scared. They don't know what they've done. They don't know what they've killed. They bury this child, the juvenile. They don't know where the other one runs off, and the adult is dead somewhere. And then he takes off and he leaves. 6 weeks later, for some reason, he posts in a hunter's forum his experience with his experience with this creature and shooting it, and I don't know why, I don't know how this connected, but Derek Randles, who I mentioned earlier, who's in charge of the Olympic Project, who's a big Bigfoot researcher, and he's not really a well-known. Derek Randles is not well known in Bigfoot research. Publicly, but within the Bigfoot community, he's kind of a legend, and really, I think people respect him within the Bigfoot community, and he's kind of a leader. Jeff Meldrum will reach out to him, for example. So he talks to Justin Smeja, and he said, "Hey, let's go up and see if we can recover the body." Well, by the time they get up to recover the body, because Derek Randles wants to investigate this, a big snow came through and covered the area. So they had to go back many weeks later to try to find where they buried this body. By the time they were able to do that, they found this chunk of flesh with hair on it. Could have been a bear for all they knew, but that was where Justin said he thought he buried the juvenile. And what was strange too about this time that I didn't quite understand until I got more involved is some other guys followed him, and I think his name was Tyler Huggins and Bart Cartino. They wanted to be part of this discovery too. They interviewed Justin. So, but it was really Derek who started this project with Justin Smaja, and I noticed that there was a lot of territorialism in the Bigfoot community, the Sasquatch community, again, that I didn't understand. Very political, right? So Bart Cartino and Tyler Huggins Tyler Huggins is a real estate agent who thinks he's a Bigfoot researcher. He's got some kind of a certification with the Bigfoot Research Organization, the BRFO. I have no idea that any of this stuff is real. So they're kind of encroaching on Derek Randles' territory. They show up to go and find this creature. Derek is kind of pissed off. Somehow Derek ends up with a piece of the sample of this creature that was shot and killed allegedly, and so did Tyler Huggins and Bart Cartino. And I don't care. I just am fascinated by the story about Justin Smaja and this adult creature, supposedly a Sasquatch, and its two children, and the fact that Justin shoots the adult and then shoots the kid. Anyway, difficult for me to understand. But such a fascinating story. And I'm kind of telling you that because I want to explain why I even believed any of this or got involved at all. Because it is, this is where critical thinking comes in, right? So I start to talk more with Derek about the genomic analysis happening with Melba Ketchum. She gets a sample. She gets the sample from Derek Randles because she's also some kind of a quasi leader within the Bigfoot community. She has a Facebook page. People are following her. Again, I have no idea that these communities even exist online. I think that this is legitimate science and legitimate research because I just had no exposure to kind of these online communities where people aren't really themselves. They have pseudonyms, they have fake names, they're anonymous, and I was just mind blown by, and so I kind of liken it to QAnon and these QAnon forums and people pretending to be something that they're not and pretending to have knowledge that they don't really have. But in a way, it creates an alternative universe for them because apparently, or either as an escape or because their real life sucks. But I'm naive, so naive to what's happening, to what's really happening. I'm really thinking Melba Ketchum's a scientist. So, and Derek Randles sounds so intelligent. And he's telling me about her, and he wants to know if I'll talk to her, right? Because there are people and he calls them people. I don't realize it's these people in the online communities, in the Bigfoot forums who are kind of criticizing Melba. Well, he wanted someone to validate that, Melba was who she really was. So I had the opportunity to talk with Melba Ketchum on the phone many late nights. And at first, she sounded very intelligent. And it's kind of this Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Where someone knows enough to sound like they're right, but they don't know enough to know or realize they're wrong. And we don't realize that they're wrong. But it's not just that she thinks she's right, but then we think she's right as well, right? Without really being skeptical enough to push back and say, well, now wait a minute. And what was interesting for me, my experience is I was so wanting this to be real. Because the story was so compelling. I had my own kind of fantasy as a kid when I would see that Sasquatch walk across in the film, the Patterson Gimli film. You know, I want the mysterious to be real, right? And the unknown to be real. It is kind of a fantasy, and it's entertaining. So when she would talk to me at first, she just sounded brilliant. She did understand DNA. She understood some very basic genetics in terms of breeding animals. And I've come to find out as I'm talking to her more that she's a veterinarian. She's a veterinarian. She's not a geneticist, nor is she a scientist. And she's a veterinarian who took some very basic courses to learn how to do DNA for breeding purposes, breeding horses and dogs. That is not complicated stuff, right? She is not the person to send a sample to for analysis to determine if it's a Sasquatch, or to even identify a new species. And so I can remember thinking when I first got off the phone with her, how did this happen, right? So red flags start popping off for me, where I'm like, wait a minute, she's a veterinarian. What does she know about next generation sequencing or whole genome sequencing or species identification through DNA? How does she know how to use BLAST? Like, you can go onto the NCBI database online. If you have a sequence of DNA, you can paste it in or copy it or upload it and do a BLAST analysis to see if the sequence you have matches any of the known species in that database. How did she know how to do that? And yet believes that Sasquatch is, some kind of an angel, right? So as I would talk to her, she then starts to tell me that her original DNA that she analyzes is completely human. She analyzes chromosome 11, which is well preserved over time, but that's well preserved for human. So she's kind of goes into this analysis with a bias. I shouldn't say kind of. She completely goes into the analysis with a bias. Recognizing that she wants this creature to be human. In fact, she would call them the forest people, and that they deserve rights too, right? That they're just humans that live in the forest that are super hairy and very tall and have magic powers. So I'm just like, this is effing nuts. What's going on? But maybe there's something here. Maybe there is something to, I really wanted Justin's story to be real. I wanted to know what that was that he saw. He took a lie detector test. He sounds very sincere, even to this day. He sounded sincere to me when I talked to him on the phone. And Brian Sykes even analyzed, and Brian Sykes is a real geneticist from Oxford who did kind of conclude the study. He kind of helped to recognize that there might be, or there is, still flat-faced bear species alive, which was thought to be extinct. Even he, was involved in analyzing this sample, which really did turn out to be bear the whole time. But because I wanted so badly to, understand what was going on, I kind of overlooked Melba Ketchum's complete insanity and the Bigfoot community's insanity. It's completely insane, just like QAnon. It's cultish. It's factions. There are factions. There are people, different belief systems. It's like a religion. And I don't know how many communities are like that online. There must be millions, where people create these alternative universes and expect you to think that they're real. So so I can recall specifically speaking to Tyler Huggins and Bart Curtino and They had said that the sample that they got from Justin Smeja, they took to a real scientist in Canada and analyzed that, or a scientist there did, and realized it was bear. But to begin with, it didn't come across as bear. One of the main reasons for that, and this is why the original DNA was so compelling, because there were sequences that were difficult to analyze. The first analysis that the scientists in Canada did, it was too difficult to do, partly because Americanus, or the black bear sequence, was not in the NCBI database, but I think pandas were, so you would get a panda bear sequence in the run for BLAST on NCBI database, or you would get some other kind of untoward sequence that you weren't expecting, and human as well. And so when Melba sees that, she immediately assumes or believes that must mean it's that Sasquatch is part human and part something else, right? That the mitochondrial DNA is 100% human, completely conserved over time. Chromosome 11 is where she started, and that's how she wrote her scientific paper. She wrote a full scientific paper. She actually submitted the scientific paper to Nature. I saw it myself. I saw her reviews from Nature. So Nature publication is incredibly difficult to get published in. And I was very surprised. And this is another reason why I was kind of like falling for this stuff, because Nature didn't immediately reject her paper. They sent it back with revisions, which was, I thought, if they didn't reject it outright, then they must be thinking that something's here. Well, so I read those comments. She shared them with me. I knew exactly what they wanted to see in revisions. Their questions were excellent. The revisions they asked for were excellent. They wanted to see the sequences themselves. They wanted to see the original data. Well, what was crazy is that her response back to Nature, the most renowned scientific journal in the world, that's actually giving her the time of day, they're giving her some attention. She writes back in her response why they are wrong, why they are wrong with their questions, and she's not going to share the raw data with them. So of course they rejected it. But I was just like, what the hell is going on with this lady? Well, what was going on is she had a clear anthropomorphic bias. She believed that these are people, the community around her that supported her, the online community, I should say, right? These people don't really have friends. Their friends are all, aliases of people that live in other parts of the country. And that this faction of the Bigfoot community had a specific belief system, and that belief system she wanted, and she expected to, this faction of the Bigfoot community expected her to validate and prove and establish their doctrine of what Sasquatch is. It is so religious. It blows my mind. I could imagine early Christianity being like this, right? Like there's all these factions of Christianity. Central figure is Christ, but there are these factions about who he was he resurrected, et cetera, et cetera. So, these different factions, kind of end up creating their own doctrines. And the one faction that wins is the one that gets promoted by the Roman emperor anyway. But that's kind of how this felt. And so it was very much as though all of her work had to prove, no matter what the DNA was actually saying, had to prove that her doctrine of Bigfoot was the correct doctrine. And here's the doctrine of Melba Ketchum and others that follow her in the Bigfoot community: that Sasquatch is real, that it is the hybridization of a human female 10,000 years ago a human female mated with an unknown primate species, male species. And the Bigfoot or Sasquatch is the offspring of that hybridization event, and somehow just continued to reproduce and create a whole species out of this hybridization event. But whenever you would ask, and anytime I would ask her, where is the evidence for this primate, unknown primate in the whole genome that she had analyzed? And because when you look at the whole genome, when you look at all the data, it's clearly there are unknown species, but partly because it had contamination. It also had the NCBI database wasn't fully uploaded or fully loaded with the Ursus americanus genome, which is black bear genome. So once that was uploaded, if you went on to the NCBI database today, if you went to the journal that published her paper and you pulled the sequences and put them into BLAST, you would find Ursus americanus is the species with some contamination. And that was one of the things the Nature peer reviewers had suggested, that she needed to rule out before they would publish the paper. She needed to rule out that there was no human contamination in that sample. And she refused to do it. She was so sure that her process was so perfect, there was no way she could have human contamination, because she wanted to maintain her doctrine that these creatures are human, that they are the hybridization of a human and some unknown primate. So when you would really ask her and push her, she would this is what she told me, that she couldn't figure out what this DNA was for the male progenitor of the species, the Y chromosome. She told me that she sat on her back porch, looking up at the sky, praying, and has a revelation that that somehow this DNA is folding in on itself, and probably came from an angel or from outer space, otherworldly. So this primate species is an unknown that mates with this female. She even goes on to say that it might be the Nephilim, or the from the Bible, the giants that were in Genesis. And so the doctrine continues, and her doctrine includes the shape-shifting ability of the Sasquatch, the ability that they have to use infrasound to paralyze people so they don't get discovered, and that they can they can disappear, and they can travel through portals between Michigan and Texas. So they can visit her in Texas and then go visit her friend, the Robin, the forest people lady in Michigan. I talked to Robin. Robin's nice, but she believes she lives in a community of Sasquatches, but they can't be seen. So never did Melba Ketchum see a Sasquatch. She just believed in a doctrine and did everything she could to prove that doctrine, even manipulating science to prove it. To go further with that, and some of this kind of makes me angry, and it makes me worried about all doctrines and all dogma. We make them up as human beings. We absolutely make it up. But then we try to say, well, no, it wasn't me that made that up. Melba Ketchum's not gonna ever admit that she made this up, that she manipulated the DNA, or at least she believed what she was seeing in the sequences were, a hybridization event instead of contamination from a human, right? She never let anyone sequence her DNA or any of her lab assistants' DNA. That's how you would prove that was not contamination. if it wasn't contamination, then you should gladly go and have your genome, and your DNA analyzed, and anyone who handled that sample should have their DNA analyzed. She wouldn't do it. Neither would she have her lab assistants do it. And so you can't rule out contamination. She didn't want to talk about contamination. She did not want to talk about any evidence that would not support her doctrine. And so I became pretty good friends. I feel like I did, and maybe I really didn't. Maybe I was fooling myself with Randles. He was so genuine. He wanted so badly to resolve this issue because the Bigfoot community was rallying around these factions, right? And he's kind of like one of the founding fathers, or one of the church fathers, right? And he's trying to maintain a unified church of Bigfoot, if you will. And so I wanted to help him. One of the ways that I thought I could help him was to get Melba to release her sequences to the public. She wouldn't give them to Nature. She, and she had this website that, or just a web platform. And so I eventually had convinced her, just put this out through your website publicly. She wanted it to be a journal. She wanted it to be a journal that we create, that has peer review and that legitimately publishes her paper, like an online journal, a self-publishing journal. The problem with that is that every time we tried to do something like that, anyone who peer reviewed the paper would say the same thing, right? There are problems. There are problems here. And if she would have just addressed those problems, this was what was going on in my mind. I know today that that would never happen because, again, this is a church, it's a religion, it's a doctrine for her. And so never would she correct anything or take feedback from peer reviewers. This is why when I talk in my critical thinking video, I mention peer review. There is real value in peer review. And what she still claims today, and people who follow her claim today, is that the scientific community is biased, right? We're biased against her. We're biased against Sasquatch. The scientific community just is not willing to see new evidence. No, the scientific community loves new evidence. And there's a rigorous process in the scientific community that the scientific method requires critical thinking and critical analysis. When someone asks a question that sounds critical of your hypothesis, embrace it, because it will fine-tune your hypothesis. When you reject it, you don't have a hypothesis. You have a doctrine. You have a religious dogma. And so that's kind of why I push so hard on critical thinking and peer review. So I think the thing that really blew my mind is that I thought I had convinced her, we're not going to publish a journal. No one's supporting that. No scientist is going to support you with a positive peer review. And she believed that if a peer reviewer sent back her paper and said, this will be approved if you make these revisions, she believed that it was approved. She believed that they saw the same thing that she did. She completely ignored the critique and would not take feedback and make adjustments and change. And or their conclusions were, this is probably bear, and this is probably a contamination. It's a bear we don't know about. It's a bear we don't have in the NCBI database. But there's a problem, Houston, so don't publish this. So I thought I had convinced her to publish her paper and her DNA sequences online through a text file. And I spent time trying to put this website together. I don't know anything about doing that. It looks terrible. It sucks. It's called De Novo Accelerating Science. And she went in that night, the night before it went live, and she changed it to be, well, in fact, I didn't want it to, actually, I just wanted her to go onto her website, the Sasquatch Genome Project, and just release it instead of going through this de novo, scientific accelerating science webpage, because it's not peer reviewed. It's not a journal. That's not a real journal. De novo accelerating science was made up. She did not purchase the journal. She claims that she purchased this journal because the scientists thought it was too controversial, and it really did pass peer review. I mean, there's so many mental gymnastics. This is the same thing that we're seeing with all the mental gymnastics happening right now with Trump. People believing that he really did win, people believing that, votes were somehow stolen or fraud. There's no evidence. There's no evidence. But when someone you love and trust tells you, you end up believing it. And I just want to be clear that the opinion of someone you love and trust is not evidence. In fact, it may very well not be true. So I get up in the morning and she has made a press release that this journal that wasn't real had published her paper, and then withdrew it. And the only way she could really publish it with the peer reviews was to purchase the journal. She didn't purchase the journal. She didn't purchase anything, and sends it out online, and then goes on all these, these channels and these. In fact, I think one of her supporters, Dr. Swenson, went on Joe Rogan, or was interviewed by Joe Rogan. It was somewhat, and this is like 2013, February or so. It got pretty popular, and the Bigfoot community went crazy. And then to the degree I kind of was in fear for my safety. I didn't know. I mean, I received a phone call from some weird person on that had a blog, people trying to disprove or trying to, attack Melba Ketchum and everybody surrounding her. And unfortunately, I became associated with her to some degree, not to a great degree, because no one would remember me today. But I'll tell you, it's kind of a dangerous community, not unlike QAnon. And so it is so important, and I would say this to anyone that might be involved in an online community, including a Facebook group: be so careful, because Facebook and the online community is a breeding ground for cult-like behavior. People who want to believe a narrative, that want to subscribe to a narrative and get people to believe in that narrative. And sometimes that's for power, sometimes that's for prestige. Melba Ketchum wanted to be the queen and leader and prophetess of the Bigfoot community. She wanted to be the one that everyone looked to, that Adrian Erickson, whoever that was, looked to. I mean, it's so stupid. It's so stupid. When I finally saw these secret videos that were supposedly super confidential of the Bigfoot that they received these samples from, it looked like a Chewbacca mask and some kind of a furry creature breathing, laying down and breathing. I mean, it was so mind-blowingly stupid. And so there is no evidence whatsoever that Bigfoot exists, that Sasquatch exists. There's no evidence at all. We see primate species today that are very rare, that we can locate, we can observe them. We have scientific evidence, all kinds of scientific evidence to describe them. No such thing occurs with Sasquatch. Everything, all evidence relating to Sasquatch is anecdotal, and it's BS. And Jeff Meldrum, bless his sweet heart, he is a good scientist, but he is somewhat biased I don't know what it is that's going on with Jeff Meldrum, and I think this could happen with any number of scientists. I think I've even seen it before with scientists that I've worked with, where they so strongly want to make their hypothesis, real or true, they can't get off that note. They keep playing that note on the piano and they can't stop. That's Jeff Meldrum, because the only evidence that he has ever talked about are footprints. And some of the things that he talks about, like a mid-tarsal break in a footprint, which you don't see, he claims, you don't see in humans, we actually do see in modern day Homo sapiens sapien. There are modern day humans with that same phenomenon. So that is not just unique to archaic hominins that are extinct. So if you have the book, Legend Meets Science, please know that it is entertainment science. It's not genetics. He doesn't know anything about genetics in that book. He does know enough to recognize that Melba Ketchum is full of BS herself. So there was always kind of a fight between those two. So I think this is just my own personal example of the importance of critical thinking and recognizing your own bias. And when there are red flags, when you know that there is a red flag in a claim that someone is making, and just because other things that they are saying is accurate and sounds smart, don't dismiss those red flags, because they actually mean something. I hope you enjoyed the story about mapping Bigfoot's genome. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great night. Peace out.